how mature is your soul and like what color is your aura, your soul aura, because based on Michael Newton studies, like essentially it's a spectrum from like white is like newbie or like not very mature. A brand new soul would be pure white. And then the like most advanced souls are like deep violet. So like along that spectrum is kind of the maturity. And for me, I think it was really interesting because I think I've always had this feeling of being like second best at things in life and being like okay with being like good but not like the best at things. And so that's kind of like my mentality with most things. So then when I first read his book and I asked myself the question of like, I wonder what like maturity my soul is at, I was kind of like just being really humble, right? I was like, I'm gonna say I'm probably on the like immature end, like white. Maybe I'm like slightly graduating into yellow, you know, like because I, especially recently, right, in the past like several years with all the like psychedelic journeys and like self-growth things I've been doing, I feel like to even care about these things, I'd have to be a little bit more than white color. And so that was one of my big surprises, is that I'm actually a more mature soul than I thought. So I saw myself as yellow with a ring of blue, which means I'm like slightly graduating into like, because blue and violet are like the most mature states. So it's like I'm veering into that with this like ring. So that felt really good, I'd say, to hear that, because I was like, oh, I've done more things than I like thought I did. And also because then related to that, this like overarching theme that came up throughout a lot of the conversation was like me kind of underestimating myself or like not giving myself enough credit or like enough self-love or attention, and kind of like overextending my energy for others a lot. So it was just kind of nice to like have that be recognized of like, oh, okay, so I'm not just like making this up. I am like, I mean, compared to like your average soul or person or whatever, I do veer a little bit more this way. But that was definitely one of my like biggest takeaways.
So remind me again, when you're like a fully mature soul, do you still go through this reincarnation process, or are you like more or less complete in a sense?
Based on his book, there are a couple theories. So like, I think a lot of the underlying theme is like, much like human existence, a lot is your choice. Like there's still like freedom of decision making in your soul state as well. So he mentioned like when you're advanced, you could keep incarnating because there are people or figures historically, right, that you're like, you have got to be like a god on earth essentially, right? Like Mother Teresa or like Jesus was a real person, you know, like these types of people who like, and Buddhas, all the Buddhas were like real people. And so you could keep incarnating even though you've kind of learned all the lessons, but you're then there to kind of like serve other people essentially, to help other people. Or you can stop incarnating and then you're only in the soul world, and then there are like other things you could be doing, because I think I talked about guides, like our soul guides. So that's a big path that a lot of advanced souls take, is then you are not the one who's like learning these lessons. You are now teaching or like guiding other souls through their lessons. So then you could become a guide. And then eventually I assume like council of elders, but that would be like really far, because that's essentially like second to whatever this godlike, you know, oneness is, with the ultimate goal of like theoretically once everyone's done incarnating forever and learning everything, you just kind of like coalesce with this oneness and you just like, you are part of the one.
You know, that's very much like the ending of The Good Place, right? They're all in heaven and eventually they're just like, you know, I'm just ready to just dissipate into nothing. I'm good.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's really interesting once you kind of like ponder over all these very different like spiritual and religious backed theories about what happens when you die, right? Because the Good Place one is kind of a mix of like, they brought in some Buddhist mentality into that, and also the idea of like going back to being stardust, right? Which is like a scientifically kind of backed theory of like, that's where we all came from initially, right? And I'm no Christian, so someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but like in theory, right, when you go to heaven, the main reason is so that you can reunite with God. I don't know if it's become one with God, but like basically like go back to God, right? Like that's go back to being with God. So when I first read in the book about this, like the ultimate state being like you then like go back to being part of the oneness, I was like, oh, I could see this like translating into what heaven and God and all that. Yeah.
What does it feel like to know that you're, let's say, close to that stage?
Oh, I'm not close. It's pretty far still.
Well, you're like 2 colors away, right?
Yeah, but I think those last 2 colors are like thousands of lives still, you know what I mean? But it feels good to know I'm not like so in the beginnings of everything, mostly because it means that I am learning and I'm not just like repeating my mistakes over and over again, because every life is distinct, right? But like I assume that like the way that I behave in this life must have some parallel with how I've behaved in like all my other past lives and what my soul is like in its like eternal state. And so for me right now, like I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect, but I can see where like I am slowly making improvements in things, and like it's not easy, but I can like recognize where I'm not repeating the same mistakes that I've made before. And so it's nice to get that recognition that like that must be more like a broader theme, not just in this life.
What do you feel like in your mortal self, pondering about your immortal self? I know a lot of people think about that, like you think about your soul, you think about the afterlife, but having an experience like that is quite different from just like theoretically thinking about it, right? So how does that make you feel? Like, do you feel really great about it, or you're very proud of it, you're anxious? Because I've definitely had at least like one night, like maybe when I was like 22 or something, and I was like, oh my god, I only have like 50 years left, and I freaked out. I could not sleep. I'm not kidding you. I was like, I only have 50 years left. Like I couldn't go to sleep.
I hope you're not only projecting 50 years from 22, man. Longevity has improved quite a bit since then. Well, I'm wishing for many more decades past that for you. But I feel great. It's hard to describe, right, if you've never done it. But again, I would say the closest proximity is any psychedelic journey. So if anyone has ever done one of those, especially for therapy purposes, you know, even when you've discussed using MDMA for party settings, right, that feeling of love that you feel is so deep and so true that it almost is hard to like recapture that exact feeling in your like non drugged up state, right? I would say it's similar to that in terms of like the feelings that you feel when you're in this like soul state and in psychedelic states, right? For like other emotions. Because one of the things they wanted to impart on me after I've like asked all my questions, and they were like, she was like, is there anything else you want to ask them or anything else they want to say to you? And I was like, no, but they are just sending this energy towards me of like making sure I know that they're proud of me. That feeling of like them being proud of me was just the deepest feeling of acknowledgement and like being seen. And it was really interesting because one of the things I didn't like write it down in my questions, but I like knew coming in was probably going to come up, is something we've talked about a lot. I care a lot about what people think, right? And like it's something I keep struggling with, especially with more of our stuff being super social media based and like everyone on the internet getting to say whatever they want about me and us, right? And so when they were sending those feelings of like, we're proud of you, I knew in that moment that this is the feeling I'm actually chasing for when I'm seeking the approval of other people, but I will never achieve this same feeling from those outside external forces, because all of that I'm seeking of like people being, you know, impressed with our content, or like back when I was in corporate, like being seen so much that I get promoted or like whatever, right? All those things are superficial because it's based on things I do as opposed to who I am. And the feeling of like being proud of me, they wanted it to be clear that it was like they are just proud of who I am as a like person, as a soul. And that is the most important thing, that like that has so much value. And that feeling, I cannot, like, even when I try to think about it now, I'm like, I remember it feeling so good, but I could not possibly recreate that feeling in my like head or my heart right now.
Wow, that is super interesting.